So on this course, we've got individual action and joint action. Now, right now we're back to thinking about individual action, and we've got three elements in view. We've got decision theory, relatively formal way of thinking about it. We've got what philosophers have said about it, and then we've got the dual process theory of action from Dickinson, which comes from theory about animal learning from psychology. So you think we've got the psychological, the philosophical, and the, roughly speaking, economic, the formal decision theory. What we're looking at is what are the connections between these three things? What kind of trouble can we get ourselves into as philosophers in thinking about how these three things connect? Now you might be thinking, Steve, that's a kind of strange thing to do in a philosophy course. Why not just confine yourself to the philosophy, right? As people sometimes say, stay in your lane. But I think that's a mistake, because the study of action surely has to be something that incorporates all of these different ideas. We do need a formal model to anchor our thinking. We do need some psychological discovery so that we understand something about how the mind works. We do need the philosophical framework. So it's important to see whether or not those things go together. I think a lot of the time people assume that they must somehow go together. They have a kind of mindless optimism about it, but when we look at it in detail, we find that there are some interesting problems along the way. And I want to show you one of those right now, connecting the dual process theory to the decision theory. Now, if you've been following along, I've already suggested to you how these things might connect. If we focus just on the goal-directed process, we've got these notions, the belief and the desire. Now, in some sense, these are kind of familiar. Philosophers talk about these things all the time. On the other hand, when you ask a philosopher, well, what is this? It's actually really difficult to get a straight answer that more than one philosopher would actually agree with, right? And it doesn't seem right here that we ought to just pick a theory. So the promise that we have from decision theory, which seems to be consistent with what Jeffrey is attempting, is that decision theory will provide us a way of understanding these notions, or if you like, with replacing them with notions that we have a better understanding of that can do the work. Decision theory will tell us, we hope, what it is that these things are, because the subjective probabilities and the preferences are theoretical constructs relative to decision theory. And secondly, it will tell us how those two things actually lead to action. Right? That's the thing about maximising expected utility. It gives us a kind of link between the states and the actions that they ought to lead to. So the goal-directed process combined with decision theory looks very powerful. Now, as I say, I've taken this from Jeffrey. It's not my idea, it's Jeffrey's. Although, of course, he didn't have the dual process theory exactly in mind. I think it's still consistent with what he's saying. He wants to elucidate these notions of subjective probability and, as I say, of preference. Now, there's a key assumption here which is so basic that I didn't even highlight it when we talked about what preferences are. And the key assumption is that agents' actions maximise their expected utilities. Once you know the subjective probabilities and the preferences, you calculate expected utilities, and that tells you what the agent will do. There's no way that that can fail to happen, because in fact we take the actions as revelatory of what the preferences are. Now, you remember how this went. We had this a little bit earlier in the course. If you've been following along, you'll see how we had different conditions that could obtain. There could be 100 or 200 pounds. To the conditions were attached subjective probabilities, that which condition obtains influences what opening the blue door, that action, brings about. And then you have a preference ranking defined across the different outcomes that there could be. In order to calculate the expected utility, you multiply the different independent outcome probabilities by the preferability of that outcome and add up the independent outcomes to get a number. And then you just pick whatever maximises that number. Very simple idea. The assumption that we're interested in is that your actions will maximise expected utilities. But here's the thing. By action, I suppose we mean instrumental action. What else could we mean? That's to say, an action that happens in order to bring about a goal. Now here's an interesting problem. The dual process theory itself tells us that instrumental actions are not always a consequence of the goal-directed process. So we've taken the goal-directed process, we've linked it to decision theory, theoretically by borrowing the notions of subjective probability and preference in order to replace desire and outcome. So this is now, without doubt, an expected utility maximising process. But by the same token, that means that the habitual process cannot be an expected utility maximising process. This maximises expected utility. If that's right, and that's what we're taking the elucidation to give us, this process cannot also be maximising expected utility. It can be approximating to a maximisation of expected utility, if you like, but it isn't expected utility. So now here's the problem. Kind of interesting, isn't it? The dual process theory itself tells us that there are not just goal-directed processes. So if we use the elucidation to link the goal-directed process to utility maximisation, the habitual process isn't utility maximising, but any action is a consequence of both processes, and sometimes the habitual processes dominate. So not all of our actions will maximise expected utilities after all. But now we find ourselves going in a very strange circle, because the failure of this key assumption means that we failed to characterise subjective probability or preference at all. Right? We needed this assumption in order for game theory to be a way of providing a characterisation of preference and subjective probability. So if we reject this assumption, then we haven't characterised those notions after all. I think this is kind of like captivating intellectually. We've gone in a circle. So we've supposed that all of the assumptions were met. We've used the assumptions to demonstrate that decision theory does indeed provide an implicit characterisation of subjective probability and preference. We've then used that to further specify what's going on in the goal-directed processes, but by virtue of doing that, we falsified one of the assumptions that we needed in order to support the claim that we'd characterised these notions at all. So we've kind of undermined ourselves conceptually by linking game theory to the dual process theory in that way, by taking this notion of an elucidation from Jeffrey and applying it to the goal-directed process. All right, so that's an interesting kind of trouble to be in if you're a philosopher or a theoretically minded psychologist. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, let's think about possible responses. So one response here might be to say, as the philosopher Donald Davidson does, the laws of decision theory are not empirical generalizations about all agents. What they define is what is meant by being rational. And Davidson, as a philosopher, was involved very much in the development of decision theory much earlier. I think even in the 50s, he was involved with Patrick Supps in some work here. And he's got his finger on one very strong tradition in decision theory. You can see the same thing in von Neumann and Morgenstern as well. They're really interested in characterizing what rationality is. So what should we say here? Well, this is a fine response as far as it goes, but our goal was not to characterize what's meant by being rational, but rather to elucidate these notions of subjective preferences, subjective probabilities and preferences. Right. So it would be great if in addition to that, we could answer the question, what is it that makes an action rational or not? That would be really, really good, right? But that's a kind of different project. That's a different project. So this response really, in a way, distracts us. We're saying, I want to make one application, but in making that application, I've kind of undermined the theoretical basis for the application itself, right? I've got into some kind of conceptual problem. And you're saying here in this response, well, yeah, but there's another way to apply decision theory. All right, that's great. That's really good. Tells us something important. It tells us that the objection we're considering is not an objection to decision theory, but just an objection to a particular construal of it, to construe decision theory as an elucidation of the notions of desire and belief which occur in the goal-directed process of the dual process theory of action. That creates a problem. But there are other ways of construing decision theory as a kind of a normative ideal, Davidson's suggesting. No problem there. So that's fine. That's fine. This response helps us to clarify what we're objecting to, but it doesn't help us to deal with the objection itself. Now, a second thought here might be, look, the decision theory stuff is an approximation. It doesn't really have to get involved too much in the messy details. And you sometimes see this kind of hand-waving in textbooks. You'll see it in a textbook on game theory, perhaps, later in the course. So I thought we should mention it here as well. So sometimes, I think this is kind of something that economists sometimes find attractive. Look, yeah, there are all kinds of messy details, but what we're trying to do is to get at a larger thing. Now, I think there's again something to this response. You see, if we were interested in predicting how a population of people will act, then decision theory might give us a great deal of predictive power. And indeed, by ignoring the complication of the habitual versus dual goal-directed process, it might give us greater predictive power than attempting to fill in all of those details. So in some senses, this is actually a very plausible response. If what we were interested in doing was predicting the behaviour from the outside of animals who actually their actions are guided by habitual and goal-directed processes, if we were just interested in predicting their behaviour, decision theory might provide us with a good approximation. But the thing about this is that that's prediction looking at things from the outside. That's prediction looking at things from the outside. Reasonable to think it works because, after all, you might well think, look, what the habitual process is ultimately supposed to do is to provide a kind of quick and dirty way of maximising expected utility. So that habitual process works in something like the way that heuristics work. It's supposed to, within a limited but useful range of situations, get you what is in effect utility maximisation without you having to do all the hard work of computing across all kinds of different outcomes and so on. So if that's right, we've got a potentially very useful predictive tool. The problem, of course, again, is that this response doesn't really answer the objection we're raising. So the objection we're raising is an objection specifically to the application of decision theory, to elucidating the notions of belief and desire as they feature in the characterization of the goal-directed process. The fact that we can approximate and get a good prediction doesn't show that we've got something which is theoretically coherent here. On the contrary, the problem with the elucidation seems to be that we've got something which is theoretically incoherent because the application to the dual process theory undermines the claim that we have got a theory of preference at all. So I turn to a different response. Not those responses are unilluminating, it's just that they do not really address the objection. So here's a different response. We might think what maximises expected utility shouldn't be actions themselves, but rather the goal-directed process. Do you see how that might be an attractive idea here? So we could sort of shift from thinking that when someone acts, we should regard their action as a consequence of the preferences, subjective probabilities, in the sense that they're performing utility maximisation. And instead we should see the goal-directed process alone as maximising expected utility. Now here's an interesting idea. This response, we are actually endorsing the objection. So the objection says, look, we have to reject this assumption. But it's offering us a replacement assumption which may well allow us to salvage the coherence of the theory. And I think that's probably right as far as it goes. It's interesting because the objection requires us to make a substantial change to the interpretation that Jeffrey proposes. One of the things I absolutely love about Jeffrey, and I think is right, that we haven't really focused on in this course, is that Jeffrey is super careful about the basic elements over which his decision theory is defined, right? He wants to motivate his choice of elements extremely carefully. So when Jeffrey says action, he's talking about something that's very carefully selected. It's a substantial change to say, all right, look, we're not talking about actions, we're talking about a particular kind of process, one among several processes that leads to action. That is kind of a big and interesting change. But now the question is, can we get away with it, right? Or do we run into further complications? So should we accept this response, make this big change to how we're interpreting decision theory, but hold on to the idea of the elucidation? Well, if we do that, we do run into at least one complication, and maybe there are others. And the complication is what's going on in the habitual process. See, in the habitual process, we rely on the idea that certain outcomes are rewarding for the agent or unrewarding, right? So that if you perform an action and as a consequence of that you get the broccoli, that might be, let's say, less rewarding than when you perform an action and an outcome occurs and you get the chocolate, right? But why is it that one of these outcomes is less rewarding than the other? Why is that? What is it that controls the nature of the reward? A natural thought, and this is what I just assumed without discussion in earlier parts of this course, is that there's a single system of preferences that underpins both the habitual and the goal-directed processes, and what makes something more or less rewarding is how preferred or unpreferred that outcome is. So the desire that we're talking about when we're talking about goal-directed processes is the very thing that determines what is more or less rewarding in the habitual process. Now, I offered that assumption in talking about this because it seems to me consistent with the way that Dickinson himself is thinking for the most part, although later in the course we'll see some complications that might motivate us to think differently, complications that Dickinson and his colleagues themselves have identified. But there's no special reason why we should hold on to that assumption. So the question is, concerning the habitual process, what makes outcomes rewarding? And here we have two possibilities. We could, as I've been assuming so far throughout the course, assume that what makes things rewarding is the very system of preference that's involved in the goal-directed process. So the habitual system involves rewards, and those rewards involve the same system of preferences. Or we could take the converse view, and we could suppose that it's not that system of preferences. Right? So with respect to the habitual process, this notion of rewardingness will come from something other than the preferences that guide the dual process theory. So take a moment, think about what happens on either possibility. I take it we don't know which of these possibilities is correct, right? But just hypothetically, suppose the second possibility were correct. Well, now things are going to get pretty messy. Things are going to get pretty messy because you've got two independent sets of preferences. Right? We'll explore this idea a bit more later, but you can see probably straight away. Imagine it's a bit like having two people inside you, right? So my habitual process loves bananas, hates chocolate, right? But when it comes to the goal-directed process, I'm like, give me the chocolate every time, right? Bananas, nah, not so interesting. But now it's like, well, I'm like being pulled apart, like two different people are inside me pulling in these two different directions. I don't think that's going to end particularly well. So there must be, if we have this view, something which ensures some kind of non-accidental harmony between the two systems, at least some of the time. Right? So we would have what I will later introduce as an interface problem right here. That's not a reason to reject possibility 2. These are things that we do not know. Right? So we're working on the basis of a theoretical guess, a very high level. We can use decision theory to elucidate the desires and beliefs in the goal-directed process on the assumption that we change decision theory so that what's maximizing expected utility is the goal-directed process and not the actions themselves. Right? So who knows whether that's correct, but if that's correct, then this would be a theoretical possibility, and we would have to find out, by actual observation whether or not it was correct. It's not up for us as theorists to make some kind of stipulation. So what I'm saying here is that if this possibility is true, we've got an interesting further theoretical problem, which is how the two systems of preferences relate to each other. Right? I'm assuming that they must somehow, at least some of the time, non-accidentally be in harmony. We want to know how that harmony is achieved. And that's what we'll call later an interface problem. The other possibility is that we've got one and the same set of preferences involved in both cases, the habitual and the goal-directed. But what you notice now is that we're taking an even more radical turn in our discussion of decision theory. Because in Jeffreys, and I suppose almost anybody else, the assumption is that if decision theory provides an elucidation of these notions, that's it. We've characterised the notion of preference. We've characterised the notion of subjective probability. We know what they are. They are the theoretical constructs of that theory. But now it turns out, if this possibility is right, that those preferences have a life outside the scope of that theory. So we cannot, after all, regard the theory as providing a complete elucidation of those things. We cannot regard them as theoretical constructs of that theory because they have a life outside it. So the reason using game theory as an elucidation of those notions seemed so appealing in the first place is because they were so hard to pin down. But now it turns out that if we take possibility one, if this is the truth, then game theory by itself isn't really serving to pin down those notions after all. They must have some kind of life independent of the theory, so they can't be regarded as mere theoretical constructs. And so that would be, again, a rather significant change to decision theory and how we're using it. So what can I tell you here? I want to draw a modest conclusion. I think Jeffrey makes a very interesting and compelling, initially anyway, suggestion when he says, look, think of decision theory as a way of elucidating the notions of subjective probability and preference. We can think of those as theoretical constructs where the theory is decision theory. That's fabulous. That offers us a solid anchor on which to rest all kinds of further theories, like the dual process theory of instrumental action. The problem is that the dual process theory of instrumental action, if true, at least complicates and maybe even contradicts Jeffrey's claim that decision theory provides an elucidation of these notions of preference and subjective probability.